Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Way T. Lightheart here for the Awesome Health podcast from Bioptimizers. And I'm so excited today because I am right here at the Biocybernaut Center in Sedona, Arizona. And a few years ago, I came here and had an amazing transformation in my capacity to think and also a spiritual opening. And we're going to talk about that today with my good friend and the facilitator of Biocybernaut Center, Dr. Hardt.
Hey, good to see you again.
So
Wonderful
good to see you again.
Yes.
It's great. It's great to be here. Of course, right now as we speak, Dr. Hardt is taking his time to slip out between us. They're working in the lab, literally on people's brains. So let's get into this. What is Biocybernaut and what is it that you do here?
Well, there's many ways to say that. Biocybernaut, a biocybernaut, is to inner space what an astronaut is to outer space.
Right.
And so the suffix "naut" is a Greek suffix that implies somebody who goes on an adventure. Mm-hmm. And so bio, it's a biological adventure. Cyber, we use electronic technologies to process brain activity so that we can, in effect, accelerate the process of learning to meditate from decades to hours. Our process is a 7-day training which produces in people the same brainwave changes as 21 to 40 years of Zen meditation.
I mean, that in itself is mind-blowing, right? I mean, for there's so many of my friends that know I had been a meditator for over 15 years when I first came here. And literally the breakthroughs that I was able to make in consciousness or awareness or brain functionality, there was a variety of different benefits, was a radical shift. I mean, and literally that is what I experienced. And we came back and did it again. Yes. It was so much fun. So before we get into that, let's talk about Dr. Hardt and your backstory. Because you're probably what the world would say is the foremost expert in, what would you call it, brain training? How would you like the terminology?
Brain training, yeah.
Yeah, brain training. And you've been doing this quite some time and have created some technological breakthroughs that have never been replicated or duplicated. Do you want to talk about your backstory a little bit for our listeners?
Well, when I came to brainwave training, I was a physics major, a Protestant fundamentalist. And I was at Carnegie Institute of Technology. And I came out of the student union after lunch, and there was a big hand-painted sign where every letter was a different color. And it said, Dr. Joe Camilla will speak on brainwaves and consciousness. And the time was, just 10 minutes from now. And the building was right over there, and I didn't have a class. So it was like a setup. And I went. And it was beyond fascinating. Joe Camilla was visiting a lady friend who was a painting and design teacher at Carnegie Institute of Technology. And her students had made up these colorful signs. And I was the only one there from the engineering school.
Wow.
So when the hubbub after the talk ended, I went up and I spoke with Dr. Camilla. And I said, I'm going to be in San Francisco this summer. He was at UCSF.
Right.
And I said, I'd love to have a correspondence with you. He goes, I'm too busy for that. And I said, well, how about if I write you a letter and leave big spaces, and then you can just pen in a reply if you want to and send it back. So we established a conversation. Meanwhile, I went to the library and I read everything I could find on brainwaves. Turns out that they were first discovered in 1908 by an Austrian psychiatrist named Hans Berger. There's a very interesting story there because Dr. Berger, or Dr. Berger, was conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian Empire's army to fight in one of their interminable wars in the Crimea. And while he was there, because he was, PhD and an MD, he was an officer, he had a horse. His horse was shot and fell on him and broke his leg. So he spent many long weeks, months in a military hospital, a Krankenhaus in German. And when he got home to Austria months later, and he told his story, his sister took him into her bedroom and showed him her tuggy book, her diary, in which she had written every detail of everything that had happened to him, including the way the horse had fallen and every detail. So this Germanic scientist now is suddenly thinking that there might be something to all this ESP nonsense. He'd heard about electrical waves in the body, so he went looking for electrical waves in the brain, thinking it would be the basis of ESP. Now, with his very primitive technology, he could only find the very biggest brainwave. That happens to be alpha. And he called it alpha. It was the first one. It's not the fastest, not the slowest, but it's the biggest. And he kept it a secret for 10 years while he did some really amazing research. I read some of the original papers in German. And he found, for example, that high anxiety people have lower alpha, a very important discovery. And then, but with his primitive equipment, he couldn't make the link to ESP. Later, and I'll jump ahead, at one point in 1983, I had the privilege of training 2 officers from Army intelligence, Lieutenant Colonel James McLaughlin, who had actually died in Vietnam, a documented case of near-death experience, coming back and having verifiable information that he got while dead. And the other was Lieutenant Colonel John B. Alexander, who they came and they did 2 weeks of training. They did the Alpha 1, each of them, in a separate chamber, and then they did a week of shared feedback, where they went into the chamber together, and they each heard their own and each other's brainwaves. And I told them that there was a chance that they might have telepathic experiences. Well, they had wanted me to do shared feedback with them, but because they had high security clearances and I had none, they didn't allow that.
So the Army doesn't believe in this, but then they don't want to take the chance that it could possibly be correct.
Well, it was interesting because they were sent by a 3-star general, Bert Stubblebine, who had used the gifts of Army intelligence to look forward in time. He saw funding cutbacks coming, and so he wanted to do more with less, and he implemented a program that I was actually a part of, where I had the privilege of training 2 12-man teams of U.S. Army Green Berets, and so on a secret Army base in Virginia. And so the 2 Army lieutenant colonels, when they did the shared feedback, actually had telepathic exchanges, secrets slipped between them. And this is all described in now Colonel Alexander's book called The Warrior's Edge, which, although it's out of print, you can still sometimes buy a copy on Amazon for $300 or $400. It's become a cult classic.
Wow.
So we have the imprimatur of U.S. Army intelligence confirming that the Biocybernaut shared feedback training produces telepathic exchanges.
That's really incredible.
And that's what Dr. Berger was looking for and couldn't find with his early primitive equipment.
So fast forward now, because we've touched on a lot of different things. So you ended up out in USCF, or UCSF, excuse me, and you're out to see Joe Kamiya.
Dr. Kamiya, yeah.
Yes. What happened after that? How did you make the transition suddenly to be this biocybernaut?
Well, when I graduated college, I got on my Triumph motorcycle. A fine bike, a 600, and I rode first to visit relatives in Illinois from Pittsburgh, then to visit relatives in Minnesota. Then I took the Trans-Canadian Highway out, camping along the way in my sleeping bag, visited relatives in Washington, and then finally down to San Francisco. And I looked up Joe Kamiya, and I volunteered as a research subject in his lab. It was pretty primitive conditions. He had a house at the edge of campus, a dilapidated house. It was kind of sinking into the sands of like near the beach. And every few weeks he'd have to go out and pump up the jacks to kind of like level the house. But it had a PDP-15 mini computer, which was like, it was like the Holy Grail.
Right.
And it was running a biofeedback program. It was in a bedroom in this house. The feedback chamber was a closet off the bedroom in which there was a chair, a wooden armchair. There was a little table with a box containing 3 Nixie tubes. Now, Nixie tubes are vacuum tubes that have filaments in the shape of each one of the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and depending on which pins of the tube you power, the different filament will light up. And so every 2 minutes there would be a score which would quantify the energy from one site, the middle of the back of the head, and there was one audio channel, which was a large speaker about this big, no cabinet. It was sitting on an orange crate in the corner of the closet, and it had a big tear in it. And so when my alpha waves would get bigger, the speaker would make more sound, and a torn speaker fuzzes out. Now, if I had been an audiophile, I would have freaked out. I wasn't, and so I just took the fuzzing out as like an opportunity to merge into that fuzz. And it turns out merging is a key skill for any manifestation or any work of magic. Desire, expectation, and merging are the three things. And so I've actually attempted to duplicate the benefits of that torn speaker by what we call burbles. So normally now when people hear their brainwaves, they hear them as musical tones. And if you could turn this way so I could point to the back of your head.
Sure.
Yeah. So O1, O2, C3, and C4. And the tones are bum, 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 bum. And so each one of those tones comes now from a different speaker. And you initially hear yourself as flutes, synthesized flutes. But if you go above a certain level, it turns into an oboe. And so there's this sort of fuzzy, buzzy quality to the feedback, which you've experienced.
Which I have experienced. So some people are saying, Dr. Hardt, how do I actually hear my brain waves? How does that happen?
Well, if you want to practice your smile, a mirror is a perfect feedback device. It meets the three criteria for feedback, which means it has to be accurate, has to be immediate, and needs to be reasonably aesthetic. Okay, so you stand in front of the mirror and you pull your facial muscles and you get instant feedback. And so with that, you can tighter your response so you can make the perfect smile. Or maybe you're going to be in a play and you have to be the wood monster and you have to make this horrific scowl or frown. You can practice that also. So what we do with our technology is we reach into your brain. There are, like your heart has pacemaker cells. Mm-hmm. There are pacemaker cells in the brain in a structure called the thalamus, so complex that it's called a brain within the brain. There's a left thalamus and a right thalamus. And these pacemaker cells are running 24/7, whether you're awake or you're asleep, always urging your brain, be an alpha, be an alpha. But as Shakespeare might say, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune often interrupt that inner voice. And so then you walk around in stressful beta and, irritated and, unhappy and whatever, impatient. But when we reach in with the technology and we detect this subtle internal signal and we then turn it into musical sounds, it's like we have externalized a fundamental aspect of the electrophysiological substrate of your consciousness. Mm-hmm. Now, merging is one of the key skills for survival, for manifesting, for doing a work of magic. But it's hard to merge like with a mouse, or it's hard to merge, with, a pen or a piece of clothing. But it's really easy to merge with what's already you. Mm-hmm. Your brainwaves are you, and what we do is we pick them up. They're so tiny we have to amplify them about 100,000 times.
Wow.
And then the computers can process them. Now, the first thing that has to be done is we have to do what's called spectral decomposition. Now, in simple language, if you take a prism, a triangular prism, and you bring a shaft of sunlight into it, what you get is the spray of the rainbow, all the colors.
Just like the Pink Floyd cover of the album Dark Side of the Moon, right?
And so we have the electronic equivalent of that prism, and instead of a shaft of sunlight, we take a channel of brainwaves and pass it through, and we break it down into metaphorically, the different colors. Delta would be like red, and gamma would be like ultraviolet. And in between, you have, above delta in frequency, you have theta, then Schumann, then alpha, then beta, and finally gamma. And so all of these frequencies are there most of the time. And so what we do is, in the alpha training, is we pick out just the alpha, and we use the ever-varying amplitude of alpha to drive the amplitude of a tone. Different tones, bum, 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 for different places on the head. So people can have a direct, immediate experience of what's going on in their brain. And with that experience, they can change how their brain works. Just like you can change how your face looks by using the feedback from the mirror to adjust your scowl or your smile.
Right. Very, very similar to, when I was training as a bodybuilder, you would make adjustments by how your physiology is in the mirror, or that's what you needed feedback, or from your
Yes.
training partner, and then you get that right groove to develop the muscles. This is a way to electronically train your brain muscles, if you will, to get it operating in the way that you want, or perfection in internal thing. And let's talk about that right now, because
Pumping neurons.
yeah, pumping neurons. Very good. You heard it here first. So let's talk about, because there's so many different ways we can go in this, but let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits. Why should someone look at training their brain? What is the value that enhances? I mean, for our listeners, in case they're wondering.
Well, if I were a teenager, I would say, brainwaves rule!
Guitar with music. Yeah.
And they do. Your brainwaves rule your life. They rule your emotions, they rule your thoughts, they rule your feelings, they rule aspects of your physiology, how your body performs. And it turns out that the level 1 alpha training, there are 9 levels, raises your IQ an average of almost 12 points, 11.7 points.
That's incredible.
And it's stable a year out.
That is really remarkable.
Now, IQ is responsible for 10 to 20% of a person's success in life.
Mm-hmm.
And this was kind of a puzzle to psychologists for quite a while, because they found very smart people who weren't performing well.
Right.
Okay? And they traced it down to a factor that they've now called EQ, Emotional Intelligence Quotient. In fact, there's a new book by Dr. Travis Bradbury entitled Emotional Intelligence 2.0. Mm-hmm. And the book actually comes with a code. You can go online and take a little test and measure your IQ. Your EQ.
Yes.
Measure your EQ. And the code works twice. So like what we've been doing here at Biocybernaut since almost next month, it'll be a year, we've been having everyone who comes for training take the EQ test online.
Wow.
And then at the end of the training, 7 days later, they take it again. Now, what we found, and I'm just about to publish these results, I've had a journal that's very eager to receive them. The average increase in EQ goes to 100. The EQ goes to 100. The average EQ increase for men is over 12 points, about 12.6 points. For women, it's about 9.8. Now,
because men need it more than women?
that's possible. That's possible.
Right.
And this is the only gender difference that I've ever found in the effectiveness of the training in terms of the IQ boost. I should also mention, at one point, we studied creativity and found that the average increase in creativity from an Alpha 1 training was 50%. We brought in a group of Stanford Research Institute scientists for whom creativity is their bread and butter. Mm-hmm. Many of them had been working on problems that had stumped them for a couple of years. And so in the chamber in Alpha, they just solved the problems like that. We ran a control group where people came into the lab. We had measurements on their skin temperature, their muscle tension, a variety of other parameters. No change in the creativity of the people who did not do the Alpha training. So we know that it's related to the Alpha training. So we have an increase in IQ of 11.7 points. The increase in creativity is 50%, which is awesome. It makes people just, well, like we had one, and it's not just scientific creativity. We had a man who had created an artistic company. And for 21 years, he had produced images that went into production. More images than went into production, but every year, about 80 images that he produced were good enough to go into production. Well, in the 6 weeks following his Alpha training, he did 110. Instead of 80 a year, he did 110 in 6 weeks. And that didn't count. There were weekends where he did like 25 big acrylic paintings.
Wow.
Just studies in motion and, shape and form. People who watch him, it was like the paint was just flying off his brushes. And so whether it's artistic creativity or scientific creativity, intellectual creativity, or athletic creativity, increased alpha is going to give you boosts in performance. In fact, mentioning the athletic, there have been studies. Now, you can't measure brainwaves when people are moving, because brainwaves, it would be like trying to measure the sound of a cricket chirping next to an air raid siren.
Right.
The air raid siren, the muscles produce electrical signals thousands or tens of thousands of times bigger than the brainwaves. But there are some sports in which the athlete is motionless before the performance. A golfer putting, a pistol, or a rifle marksman, or an archer, or a basketball player at free throw. And in every one of these sports, the brainwaves have been measured, and then the people would shoot. Well, if there's a big burst of alpha right before the shot, it's going to be one of their best shots.
Which goes back to the traditions in Zen of Japanese archery about eventually the guy's riding on a horse blindfolded and hitting the target every time.
Riding backwards blindfolded.
That's the highest levels of mastery. Please don't try this at home until you've been to at least 3 Biocybernaut sessions. No, just kidding. So what we're seeing now is these traditional methodologies that were used throughout time, meditation and consciousness practice, and we'll get into that in a minute. You've now been able to take technology to accelerate the feedback loop as opposed to the master hitting you with a stick.
Right.
You're able to hear a symphony instead.
That's of your own brain. Well, let's use your example of like the Zen archery. Okay, now you're holding the bow. You obviously have to have enough strength to pull the bow. And what does alpha mean? Well, it's an experience of oneness.
Right.
And so when you can feel that you and the arrow and the target are one, you simply release the arrow and it goes right where you already feel it to be. And that feeling of oneness is conveyed by that high alpha state.
And I think everybody has had an experience of that at some point in their time where they enter, you see a lot of it, they're into the flow state, or there's a synchronization of people or places or things, or there seems to be a harmony to things. And one of the things that I know myself personally when I came out of Biocybernaut that was significantly pronounced. And conversely, I had a greater awareness when I wasn't in alpha. And I think that was maybe one of the other benefits that a lot of people don't know. Because if you've never done meditation or brain training or whatever, even if you had, like I meditated for 15 years, there's no way to distinguish where I am as I venture. So I'm sailing on the ocean of mind, if you will, without a compass or guide or any devices to measure this. And now comes Biocybernaut. You slip that on and suddenly I know that the currents are this, I know the wind is this, I know the direction and the longitude and the latitude, and now I'm better able to navigate my own brain.
Exactly.
And I can take that knowledge out into the world and apply it on a day-to-day basis, correct? So what are some of the things that people can do to increase their alpha, or how do they get aware of it? Like, in your experience, you've been doing this a long time. What are the things that enhance alpha in life? And then we'll get into what are the things that block alpha in everyday life. What have you noticed? Because I know there's some things.
Wonderful questions, and I want to go to them. But what I realize is that the conversation, your first question, like what are the benefits, that there's a part of that that yet remains unanswered. We talked about increased IQ, we talked about increased creativity, and started to talk about emotional intelligence.
Right.
Because it turns out that although IQ explains 10 to 20% of a person's success in life, EQ, emotional intelligence, explains 60 to 70% of the success in life. In fact, the Dr. Bradbury, in his book, Emotional Intelligence 2.2, says in every country in every profession, they've not found a profession in which the person's success is not related significantly to their EQ. And they've quantified it to the extent that for every 1 point increase in EQ, the person's average income goes up $1,300. So given that we're having men increase over 12%, 12.5 points, in the 20 years following their alpha training, this would net them almost $250,000 more, $320,000 more in income on average. And for women, with their smaller EQ increase, they're going to net over $250,000 more in income from having had the EQ boost that comes just from the Alpha 1 training.
Which is really exciting.
Very exciting.
So,
people want to know, well, if I spend the time and the money to do this work, which is intense.
It is intense.
The trainings are, 12, 14 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to make 21 to 40 years of progress in a week, there's not a lot of time to lollygag.
That's true. And now I know that I don't know how much you've developed a lot of proprietary processes over your many years of research. What is the Biocybernaut experience like that you'd like to share with people, and that process that you take people through to really explore their brain?
It's a wonderful question. And the experience is, let me talk about the mystical experience.
Sure.
The mystical experience is known by 5 hallmarks: intense realness, unusual sensations, transsensate phenomena that come to you from beyond the realm of the 5 senses, the experience of unity or oneness, and the 5th one is ineffability. Ineffable means unable to be described in words.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Biocybernaut training results in mystical experiences. So some of these are so profound that they cannot be described in words. At one time, I think it was Ramana Maharshi was asked by his students in India to describe activation of the different chakras. So he'd bring up the Kundalini to the first chakra, and he'd speak from that, then to the second chakra and speak from that third chakra. Then he'd bring it up to the fourth chakra, his heart chakra, and he would go into a samadhi, and he couldn't speak. And so then he'd come out of it and he'd say, well, what I'm really trying to tell you is, and then he'd go into it, and he couldn't speak. And after a number of times of this, tears are coming down his cheeks, and he goes, well, I really want to tell you, but the Divine Mother keeps sealing my lips, and I can't tell you what these experiences are like, which is one of the reasons that we've taken to measuring, observable things that matter to people, different kinds of performance. Now, there's also beneficial changes in personality.
Mm-hmm.
We found very early on, I published a paper in Science in 1978, documenting that in high anxiety people, when they increased their alpha above their initial resting baseline, that they became low anxiety people. Now, both state anxiety and trait anxiety were reduced. And depending on where on the head you increase your alpha, you can reduce schizophrenia and paranoia and psychasthenia and depression and anxiety. And so and some of them are fairly specific, like C3 alpha increases will reduce paranoia. And at the higher levels there, people go into profound states of trust. We always read on day 6 of the 7-day training, the Trust in the Heart Sutra of the 3rd Chinese patriarch of Zen. And one of the lines near the end of it is, the trusting mind is one with the non-dual. And so the experience of non-duality, which is a goal of most meditative and spiritual practice throughout the world, requires a high state of trust, which means, among other things, you have to increase C3 alpha.
And one of the things I noticed as we trained in our groups, the 2 times I've been to Biocybernaut, is you can literally watch people's personalities transform during the week.
Yes.
And it's remarkable. I can think of a few instances that were relatively extreme. And I had some close friends that...
Can you share?
Well, I can remember in one case, one person was very critical and a very intelligent person, but in very high standards, and was, as I said, very critical of just about everything.
Mm-hmm.
And by the end of the week, this person wasn't critical at all and was using their extraordinary intelligence to solve problems in a different way with, you could see that activation of the heart.
Yes.
And there was a combination where this person had aha moments. I also went with a business partner of mine, and what we found, both of us, is our ability to communicate and to hear each other afterwards, and how that we were able to apply that to our business transformed not only our personal relationship but also our business relationship. It was much more easy to see his point of view and vice versa for him. And it was extraordinarily transformative for us. In fact, so much we both became big advocates of it and said, wow, every business person. And of course, a lot of people out there think, oh, hooey, it's a bunch of mystical stuff. Well, the reality is what that applied to us in the bottom line of going through that experience is it, generated an extra 7 figures in our company probably within 18 months. And actually, that's not probably, that's an absolute, is some number over that, but I know it was that for sure. And a greater ease in doing it. It wasn't like we had to put the nose to the grindstone. It was like, oh, this is easy. And like proficiency, and I would say that from an exercise, when you first start doing an exercise or a workout program, it's difficult, it's challenging, or if you're learning a new skill, or maybe taking up a new hobby, there are some challenges. However, if you have a great teacher and you have a great process, you can radically reduce that time until you get into the place where it's enjoyable. And that was my experience with Biocybernaut, and I highly suggest people to do it.
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip, rapid cheat meal relief. Research shows that cheat meals can actually be an effective way to boost your metabolism. One key weight loss hormone, leptin, can be increased by up to 30% following a cheat meal. The challenge with the cheat meals is that all those extra calories and lower food quality can be hard to digest, which means you could be totally sidelined with a food coma after big cheat meals. The solution is to take strong digestive enzymes like masszymes, which will help rapidly digest and break down the extra food. 3 to 5 capsules before or right after your cheat meal can make a huge difference in how you feel following the cheat meal. If it's a cheat day with multiple large meals, you might want to go up to 10 capsules or higher to help you power through all that food. To save 10% on masszymes, go to masszymes.com. That's MASSZYMES.com and enter the code CHEAT10 at checkout.
But let's go back, because we're jumping around a lot.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the world today. Somebody's out there listening to this. There might be like most people, they have a lot of challenges of high stress. We have an increase in technological world. There's a lot of irritants in the diet that can be affecting people. You want to talk about some of the obstacles to having wonderful alpha?
Sure. We recommend when people sign up for training, we send them guidelines for how to prepare. Well, of course, getting enough sleep, 8 or 9 hours of sleep is very helpful. But also we ask people to eliminate, before they come for training, nicotine, caffeine, alcohol, onions, and garlic. And I've had many examples where very sweet people somehow got a meal or two of garlic and were transformed into angry, irritable, high-stress people. And so this is not well understood, in the food community, that there are effects in consciousness of what you eat. Now, when I began the Yogananda lessons, very early on, like within the first couple of weeks, Yogananda wrote, you want to begin eliminating onions and garlic from your diet because, he said, they promote a Rajasic temperament.
Right.
Now, in the same way that the ancient Greeks said all matter is composed of 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, which modern science understands as solid, liquid, gas, and plasma.
Right.
So the Hindu cosmology divided things into 3 elements, which were not physical things, but they were qualities or properties. The tamas, rajas, and sattva are the 3 gunas. Tamas is the principle of inertia and ignorance. Rajas is the principle of activity, ego and willfulness, and sattva is the principle of enlightenment. So a drunk lying insensate in the gutter and somebody in high meditation would both be relatively motionless, but the drunk would be high in tamas and the meditator would be high in sattva. Now, in between, rajas, if you're sitting down to meditate and your mind is agitated, this is an impediment. It turns out that onions, and to an even greater extent garlic, agitate the mind. Now, there are biochemical reasons for that. At one point, maybe in the early 70s, there was a new scientific journal that came out. It was called the Journal for the Study of Consciousness, and I became a charter subscriber. One of the articles early on was about the structure of all the psychedelic molecules. And they had like tinker toy models where the atoms would be,
Right.
and then there would be spokes. Sometimes there'd be an atom way out. Sometimes they'd be tightly clustered. Sometimes they'd be open. And they listed all the psychedelic molecules and had diagrams of their molecular structure. And these included LSD, D-lysergic acid diethylamide 2,5, delta 9-hydro tetracannabinol or THC marijuana, mescaline and psilocybin, and DMT and bufotenine. It turns out some bufo is the Latin word for toad, and some toads contain a psychedelic agent. So witches putting toads in their brew would, of course, have a psychedelic kind of trip. But along with these psychedelic drugs were onions and garlic, and they all. What was interesting is they all had, even though they looked very different, they all had one similarity. They had an atom in the molecule that was unstable, and it bounced back and forth between two positions. Now, a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth between, its two sides of the table, if an atom is bouncing back and forth, it's not going bong, bong, it's going and even faster than, you could imagine.
Right.
So I took this journal article to an organic chemist at my university, and I said, I want to know the frequency of the resonances.
Of course.
So that was back in the days when they used slide rules.
Right.
And so he had this little banker's hat, and he built and he whipped out his slide rule. And for about 45 minutes, he's like scribbling, making calculation. And then he pushes up his hat and he says, well, I think they're all in the thermal range.
Oh,
Thermal
so
range.
heat.
So now thermal's heat. Now, we all know the effects of a fever on your consciousness. People get delirious.
Right.
The brain functions differently. You hallucinate or whatever.
People would associate anger with hot. Hot. He's hot-tempered.
Absolutely. Yes.
So language is sometimes an indication
It is.
of where we
Pointer to the heart of truth. And so, because of the different shapes of these molecules, they would go to, once they cross the brain-blood barrier, they would go to different parts of the brain, and when they would break down, they would release this thermal energy, producing a localized fever in that region of the brain, thus stimulating the psychedelic experience.
Wow.
Okay? So there's a common similarity structurally in onions and garlic and LSD and psilocybin and mescaline and DMT and bufotenine and the whole cast there. And so the LSD, for example, there was a study done with cats where they wanted to know the effects of LSD on the auditory threshold. Now, if we're measuring your auditory threshold, you wear earphones, and then they play fainter and fainter tones, and you say when you hear them. Well, you can't do that with a cat. So what they did was they put a needle electrode into the cochlear nucleus, which is a way station between the mechanism of the ear that resolves acoustic energy, turns it into neural energy, and then it sends the signal up into the auditory centers of the brain. So activity in the cochlear nucleus would mean that the ear heard the sound. So they measured for a bunch of cats, then they gave them a very tiny dose, 1 microgram per kilogram of LSD, and there was an order of magnitude fall in the auditory threshold. They could hear things that were 10 times fainter.
Wow.
So the idea of, people on LSD saying they could hear the grass grow, well, they probably could. I grew up on a farm, and I know on a hot July night, you can go out in the cornfield, and you can hear the corn growing as it's expanding. There's popping, and, you actually hear it. Well, with grass growing, or enhancement of sensory perception, it was produced by that. But it also produces other alterations in perception. So it's easy to understand why you probably wouldn't want to take a psychedelic or onions or garlic if you wanted to do any work that involved working with your brain. And so we ask people to eliminate those. And many people will find that stresses, arguments in their relationships go away when they and their partner, their relationship partner, eliminate especially garlic, which makes people angry and irritable.
You bring up something that I experienced, because what was fascinating to me is I never tolerated garlic and onions well. I didn't know why.
Wow.
I never, it was a genetic thing or methylation pathway or whatever.
Body wisdom.
However, after going to Biocybernaut, my awareness if something had garlic or onion was amplified significantly.
Yes.
And I had brought this up in my relationship. I was speaking with my girlfriend, and I was indicating that I did not want any garlic and onions in my food. And she thought I was daft. It was like, come on, really? You know, and I said, no, I could really see that. And then I also would see the effects of caffeine. If I had a coffee, I could feel the shift in my brain, because now I had awareness. I could feel,
changes.
I could feel the changes in my head, which I had no awareness before. And this was correlated by my friends who had gone through Biocybernaut as well. So now we had an acute awareness. And I don't suspect that that's uncommon, but just from that alone, I got experiential wisdom, in other words, which is the best kind. It was like, this wasn't an idea, this wasn't a paper, this wasn't something out there. This was something that I could literally, tangibly experience for myself. So going from there, so stay away from garlic and onions. So going from the garlic and onions thing, why is Biocybernaut so critical for people in today's world? What would you feel? There's so much going on. There's the rapid growth in technology.
May I use a different word?
Yes.
Why is it so valuable?
Yes. Why is it so valuable?
Okay.
Because you've seen hundreds of people come through the center.
Probably in the range of 6,000 people
Right.
have done the training. And since the training is, 7 days long, I personally have had tens of thousands of interviews with people. So, yeah. Well, awareness is in and of itself healing.
Yes.
And so the more aware you can be, the better you can navigate your life in your world. Now, some of these awarenesses come unconsciously. Like in Canada, we were fortunate to have a philanthropist who put up $6 million to train not only some people from his company, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but also Canadian Aboriginals, a very oppressed people, in part because they had this residential school system that continued in some parts of Canada up until 1989, where children were ripped away from their parents or grandparents and put in these schools 12 months a year and rather brutally treated. Mottos, they had signs in the school, kill the Indian to save the man. Now what they meant was Indian culture, but in fact, Georgina Lightning, an Aboriginal filmmaker, documented that about 50% of all the children sent to these schools died there. And so the survivors are as traumatized as returning war veterans. I had a privilege of training the famous chief, Willie Littlechild, who's the first Aboriginal ever to be elected to the Canadian Parliament, National Parliament, and he said, if you have been abused and you haven't forgiven, you will become an abuser. And in the Canadian Aboriginal community, many of whom are on what they call reserves, and they don't use the word tribes, they call them bands, 80% of all the males have been sexually abused. And in some of the tribes, it's 100%. Of course, it's open season on the women. And so there's immense abuse that's passed down from generation to generation. If you've been abused and you haven't forgiven, you will become an abuser. So we have the privilege of working with hundreds of these Aboriginal peoples. And once I passed the square root of 1% of the Aboriginal population who had been trained, suddenly I'm invited to speak at the United Nations in Geneva to the Aboriginal interest section. So the work has, become recognized on a global scale because of its ability to heal. Now, I did a paper published in Advances in Mind-Body Medicine on the reductions in psychopathology in a cohort of male and female Canadian Aboriginals. We gave them personality tests before and after. And so it was November of 2012 when that paper was published. Well, 6 months later, we surveyed the people and hundreds of questions. Now, without giving them any guidelines, 6 months later, they're eating more fresh fruits, more vegetables, less sweets and less junk food, and about the same amount of meats and grains, and they're wearing smaller clothing sizes. So this is now a natural wisdom that comes as people go into a higher alpha state. They don't have to be told to eat in a healthier way. They're more aware. And awareness is in and of itself healing. And so that's healing physically, it's healing emotionally, it's healing intellectually, it's healing spiritually.
You bring up something very important, and you mentioned forgiveness. And I know that you have a proprietary process around that. And I've done forgiveness programs and things like that, and I've always thought they were a great idea and beneficial, as taught by many different spiritual traditions. Forgiveness is not necessarily for the benefit of the other person, it's actually for your own state. Now, you have actually documented this and created a process around it. You want to talk a little bit about how that's part of your process here at Biocybernaut?
Sure. Forgiveness is only effective if it's done in a condition of rising alpha. Now let's get a little racy and say, let's say...
What does that mean, rising alpha?
Let's get a little racy and say, let's say a couple, a heterosexual couple, are trying to have a baby. If the man has orgasms alone in the shower, that's not going to lead to a baby.
Right.
Okay? So that particular process has to be done in a particular kind of union.
In the right environment.
The right environment, exactly.
Right.
So if you do forgiveness and you're not in a state of increasing alpha, it will not be effective.
So what you're saying is alpha, or a certain threshold of alpha being experienced in, is the critical factor
Yes.
in whether the forgiveness is going to alter
Whether it's going to work.
Whether it's going to
Will
work.
it be effective?
And describe that as effective and work. How would you distinguish that?
Well, everybody knows of George Gallup, the famous pollster.
Right.
Even people in other countries have heard of the Gallup Poll. Well, George Gallup and Sir John Templeton were very good friends until Sir John's death. And Sir John was a very spiritual man, and every few years he would promote George to do another poll on forgiveness. I had the privilege of reading the details of one of these polls. George asked Americans if they could describe how important forgiveness was. 0, not at all; 1, a little; 2, moderately; 3, quite a bit; and 4, extremely. 80% of Americans said forgiveness is extremely important. So then, asking only those who said it was extremely important, they asked them, could you do it? And 85% said no, they could not do it. Not even God's help, not even prayer correlated with effective forgiveness. That was a mind-boggler. These people who know it's extremely important, now they're asked, can they do it? And they say no, and those 85% not even prayer correlate. Of the things that Gallup asked about, and he didn't ask about the Biocybernaut 14-step method.
Nor did he ask if they were eating too much garlic
No,
and
he
onions.
didn't. No, good point. Of the things he asked about, there was only one thing that correlated with effective forgiveness, and that was meditative prayer.
Wow.
Now, when you put the adverb meditative in front of any verb, like meditative gardening, meditative sewing, meditative fishing, meditative, any verb, what I see are more alpha waves.
Of course.
And so George Gallup has basically confirmed that effective forgiveness requires an environment of increasing alpha waves. So I've designed the 14-step forgiveness process at Biocybernaut so that people only do the forgiveness when their alpha is increasing, and they get scores every 2 minutes. And if the alpha's gone up, the scores will be blue. If they've gone up, set a new high, the scores will be green. And so if they get to the point where the scores turn white, then they go to their judges, their high spiritual beings, and they say, have I done all I can do for now? And if the judges say no, they go back, feel the pain again, and start over. And so we make sure that people only do the forgiveness work in a condition of rising alpha. And if the alpha stops rising, then they stop the forgiveness.
It's an amazing process. Number one, I've done forgiveness work before, and after going to alpha, what I determined was the depth which seems to have the transformative effect. So you know how we all have family members or people in our lives that you know, that you can go from 0 to like in like 1 second.
If you have parents, you have issues.
They can say one word. Yes, because they can say one word, and your 40 years of meditation blown. What was one of the interesting things was for me, I know that when I got out of Biocybernaut, things that would irritate me or annoy me or baffle me or confuse me or frustrate me, suddenly I would be in the same situation and it was humorous, or there was a sense of peace or a sense of calm.
Opportunity for creativity.
Yeah, and it was really remarkable because you kind of go to that space and you're like, well, I'm in that environment that normally annoys me.
Like,
and
where's the annoyance?
where is that? Where is my friend the annoyance? He's gone. And it really has to, it's one of those things that you have to experience to really understand. And of course, if you think of how many people are taking out of their creative or productive or their center of self, you think of the time that people spend in an angry, unproductive state in the world on a daily basis. Being able to access this would really harmonize. Maybe we wouldn't be fighting with each other so much.
Maybe. Yes. There is a technique in Biocybernaut for resolving conflicts. In the Biocybernaut website, it's called Reuniting Lovers. And it goes into, I wrote the paper after having a couple come for training. They were separated, heading for a messy divorce, lots of assets. The lawyers were like sharpening their knives. And after the third day, it was so bad that when I was interviewing them at the end of the day, one person would say something and their spouse would yell, "No, that's not true." So I had to take them one by one into the chamber and do the interviews for the first 2 days. By the third day, the love had kicked in. They're walking out hand in hand, no divorce. It was absolutely a remarkable healing. And so this kind of conflict resolution works for everything. Disputes between a businessman, disputes between sportsmen, disputes between family members, and the anger, the irritation, the hurt, the fear, it can be all dissolved in an alpha training.
Truly incredible. You have another process, shared feedback. You want to talk a little bit about some of the shared feedback? Because I've yet to experience that, and I'm curious.
Oh, I'd be very happy to do that with you.
Well, thank you.
We could set that up. It used to be in the university. Where I was training people one at a time. We didn't have the group model yet. On day 7, I would typically ask the people if they would want me to do shared feedback with them, and most would say yes. And they would invariably get their highest alpha ever when I did shared feedback with them. Now, the process is technically kind of simple, where you and I would be in the chamber together. We'd both be wearing half the normal complement of 8 electrodes. And so you would have some of the tones, I would have the rest. You'd see some of the scores, the rest would be mine. And we would literally be bathed in a sea of sound that included your brainwaves and my brainwaves. And the opportunity for merging would, of course, be very profound. As when I trained Army intelligence officers in this shared feedback process, they had secrets slip between them. Wouldn't let me do shared feedback with them because I didn't have a security clearance. And so, but I've had as many as 8 people in one of my chambers, 4 in chairs in the back row and 4 on cushions in the front row. And so we've had as many as 8 doing shared feedback, and people did report having secrets slip between them. It also profoundly enhances interpersonal rapport. At one point here, I was doing shared feedback with Duilio, one of our trainers. And his brother, Bianco, is a technician here. And so when we're in the shared feedback, not only do we hear each other's tones, But our hemicoherence scores, normally the hemicoherence scores are the coherence between pairs of channels on your own head. But in shared feedback, the hemicoherence would be like the coherence between here and here, or the coherence between here and here, or here and here, or here and here. And so the coherence scores are describing the ability of us to literally get into the same state at the same time.
Wow, and people have kind of had that or witness it oftentimes with people singing together.
Oh, yes.
And you see
Yes.
that and you can see it and people go, oh, the
my
harmonies
God,
and
you
these
get
type of
into
things.
it.
And
or
there's a whole,
musicians playing together.
Right.
They get into a riff and they just, it's bliss.
it is a really extraordinary experience.
So Du and I were doing the shared feedback, and we really got into it. So our hemicoherence ranges from 0 to 100%, and the scores would be 0 to 1,000. Well, we were running above 950 in all 4 pairs. And the love was so powerful and so intense that when the session was over and we came out and Bianco went in to like fold up the blankets and, rearrange things, the love field residual in the chamber was so powerful that Bianco burst into tears.
Wow, amazing.
So you can really create very powerful energy fields with people doing this, which enhances interpersonal rapport, but it can also be used to manifest more powerfully.
Which we actually witnessed that when we would do, I know there was a group of us in there, and then we would focus on kind of things that people wanted to
The
bring
intentions.
and we would actually see the scores. Let's talk about the scores for a second, because really I think what's really unique about what you've done here at Biocybernaut is you've taken a qualitative process and quantified it using technology. So it brings all of this out of the land of woo into to definitive, scientific, reviewable information, and gets out of the woo and into the science. So you're really fusing those two fields. How did you do
Spiritual
that?
science.
Spiritual science?
That's
How
what we
did you-
do here.
How did you do that?
Well, all of the creation of the technology has been done in the chamber. I go into a high alpha state, and it's like I think it's a medieval painting, which is trying to show higher spiritual dimensions. And so there's a shepherd in a kind of a cloak on his knees, and in the background there's trees and sheep and things like that. And there's like a rainbow like this, and he's looking through the rainbow, and then in the heavens are like the medieval view of what, celestial magic would be. And so I sometimes say we take people across the rainbow bridge to Everland at Biocybernaut. It came about because of an experience that I had in Joe Camilla's chamber when I was forgotten in the chamber.
Right. Well, so you're going. Now we've come full circle. We're back. You're in Joe Camina's lab with the torn speaker in the closet,
Yep,
literally.
in the closet. Yep.
You're
yep.
playing with the dials, and somebody left you in there.
Yep.
What happened in that moment?
Well, it wasn't just one moment. It was a progression. Initially, I'm a scientist. I'm a physics major, and so the tones would surge briefly, a second or so, and my rational mind would go, "What was that? How did I do that?" And of course, that would cause the tones to retreat. And after a couple of times, I realized that. So the tones would surge, and I'd to the extent I can, I'd put a leash on that part of my mind that would go, "Whirr, I want to know, tell me, let's figure this out." And so I could restrain it initially for like a fifth of a second or a half a second or something, which would allow the alpha burst to go a little longer and for me to go a little further into this state. Then I could restrain it for a second, and then 2 seconds, and then 3. And pretty soon the state is just flowing, and the rational analyzer is held in abeyance. Well, pretty soon I'm like floating out of the chair. I'm flying around the universe. I'm depersonalizing. I'm encountering discorporate beings. So when I came back from all of that, having immense states of bliss. When I came back from that, because the door got ripped open, the people who had forgotten me there had actually gone to lunch, and course 11 of a 12-course Chinese lunch, Joanne remembered, oh my God,
Yes.
and they come rushing back across town, race into the building, rip open the door. So they interrupted the late stages of this adventure, and there's 10 of them there. And they're asking me, to say what happened, because of course they were worried. This is a university facility, and this is definitely not protocol. To forget somebody there, and so they debriefed me. And so as I would talk about these experiences, Paul Gorman, who was in the group, who'd been to India the summer before, would say, "Oh, that's a meditation experience." Well, I didn't know anything about meditation. I'm a Protestant fundamentalist. We don't even know what monks are.
Right.
Although in Germany there's some Lutheran monks, but certainly not in America. And so, I'm, oh, okay, meditation, that's interesting. So I'm out of body. For about 3.5 days I walked around and my feet didn't touch the ground. But then pretty soon summer's over, and I have to ride my motorcycle back across the country because I had decided I was going to register for grad school, because somehow I needed to get my rational mind certified, because I had the feeling I'd be working with weird stuff. Okay? So I register for grad school, and then I walk up the hill from campus to there's one of these robber baron era houses in Pittsburgh, like where the maids' quarters on the top floor would house 12 maids. And it was being rented by a social psychological phenomenology professor from Duquesne, who I'd become friends with my senior year. I set up an exchange program between Duquesne and Carnegie Mellon psych department. And so Rolf had been a grad student under Timothy Leary at Harvard, and he and his wife had taken tons of LSD. So I figured, if anybody knows what had happened to me, it's going to be Rolf. So I go walk in, and he sees me, and he recognizes immediately that I'm different. He takes his arm and he sweeps everything off his desk onto the floor. He goes, "Sit down." And so for the next 3 hours, I give him the details of everything that just happened. This is written, it's on the Biocybernaut website in some detail. It's called A Tale of Self-Discovery. And at the end of the 3 hours, he smiles, he folds his hands, and he says, "We can do that here." Well, in that instant, instead of this just being something cool that had happened to me that I wanted to tell everybody about, in that instant I had a vocation. Not a career, not a profession, a vocation, a spiritual calling to share this with as many people as possible in as many ways as possible. Now, halfway through my 3-hour discourse with Rolf, his neighbor lady had come in, stood respectfully in the background, listened for a while, left, came back, and as I was talking, she came to, and she set down Yogananda's autobiography, which, if that somebody had given me that, a week before, I would have, nonsense. But now it was like, I was open. It was like many of my experiences were described in that book. So I read it, my roommate read it, he ordered the lessons, and we began doing the Yogananda lessons. So the evolution of the spiritual path, simultaneous with my development of the technology and doing the science, because as a grad student, I ran the first formal academic study of 20 students in 1971.
Wow. And to correlate that, Yogananda's spiritual teacher, a fellow by the name of Swami Sri Yukteswar, had written over 100 years ago now that there would be the development of technology that would enhance the spiritual awareness and development of mankind. And he sent Yogananda to the West because he felt that spirituality needed science in order to verify what they were doing, which was mystical. So here we have the hard-nosed scientist, has the mystical experience, and spends the rest of his life, literally, documenting and improving the technology in the process so that other people could come to a place like Biocybernaut and experience that.
Have 40 years of spiritual practice in a week.
Incredible. And I guess now you've been doing this for over 40 years, so you had the spiritual experience, and then you ended up with 40 years of work. Tell me, what's it like to be Dr. Hardt? What drives you, and why are you so passionate about this work?
Well, a gardener has extreme joy when the flowers that he's tending bloom, or the vegetables come into fruition. And so I look at everybody as immense potential which is trapped, because of their life experiences and their beliefs and, their traumas. And as they release those and open into these incredibly radiant beings, there's a great joy in that. And there's, I feel now, a larger mission, because I have come upon, very early on, about 1984, the work of Peter Russell, and a video that we show every day still on day 5 of the training called The Global Brain. Now, Peter Russell says it takes 5 to 10 billion atoms collected together in the right way to have enough complexity to have a living cell. You can't make a cell with 1,000 atoms, 100,000, even 100 million. You need 5 to 10 billion atoms to have enough complexity. Okay, well, let's take a brain cell. Let that be the cell we create. Well, now it takes 5 to 10 billion brain cells connected together by an appropriately complex central nervous system to have enough complexity for the emergence of a self-reflective consciousness, which can know it's Wade or Jim,
Right.
or Jane or Susan or whomever. And so, but at the next level up, if we were to combine the human brains on the planet, and we are now past 5 billion, we're between 5 and 10 billion, above 7 billion, we do have enough complexity for the awakening of the human collective superconsciousness, in which each one of us would be like a neuron in our brains. Now, the only thing that's missing is a suitably complex central nervous system to connect us all together, and shared feedback is the beginning of that process.
So the internet, if you will, is maybe the early version of humans' connectivity, which ultimately, if I hear you correctly, will not be necessary in the future.
Well, if we were telepathic, then this would, happen very quickly. Until then, we could use the Biocybernaut technology to connect groups of people. For example, we have 6 chambers here, 5 in Canada, 5 in Germany, and so we could have people there, and then they could all be connected. Now, this is how nervous systems developed initially in primitive organisms in the sea. You might have a few sensory cells that would detect, say, light, and a few neurons to kind of moderate that, so the organism could move toward or away from light. A few other sensory cells that could detect temperature, and a few neurons there, so it could move toward or away from a thermal vent. A few sensory cells that could detect chemicals in the water that might be either harmful or nutritious, and so it could move toward or away from that. And as soon as you got a few, it would be like a village here, a village there, a village there. The benefit of consciousness is like, whoo, pretty soon there's a brain. Because the benefits of a bigger brain for survival are so powerful that if we look at the average brain volume of our ancestors, Europeans, from, say, the 1500s to now, there's been an increase of a cubic centimeter of brain volume in just those few hundred years. Incredible. That's like Mother Nature going, and the brain getting bigger and bigger because there's survival value, greater ability to handle complexity and more awareness. Well, it still requires that the processing, be in carbon-based circuitry inside the protected environment of the skull. Well, what we do at Biocybernaut is we grow circuitry on silicon chips, which are hardy enough to be in the outside world, and then we connect those circuits with the carbon-based circuits with things called electrodes, and when you're in the chamber, you actually have a bigger brain. Your consciousness now has a hybrid platform where part of the circuitry is carbon-based circuitry in the brain, part of it is silicon-based circuitry outside the brain. And I remember we had a Polish man named Jacek, doing his Alpha 2 training in Germany, and he said to me, why is it so much easier for me to solve problems in the chamber? And I said, well, Jacek, it's because you have a bigger brain.
Bigger brains, spiritual evolution, and connectivity throughout all of humanity. That's what you're all about, Dr. Hardt. How will people reach you? So we're going to put this in the show notes. How would someone get a hold of Jim and engage in one of these life transformational processes?
Probably the easiest way is to go online, go to biocybernaut.com.
And we'll put that in the show notes.
Okay. And there's also a phone number there, so people can call and talk to somebody who's done the training and knows the schedule and make the arrangements. If they need to have a phone call with a trainer to help them understand whether their particular situation would benefit from a Biocybernaut training, then they can schedule those as well with the contact person.
Fantastic. I know you've got to get back to the chamber. You've got a bunch of group going on here. So, Dr. Hardt, a real Renaissance man. He's dedicated his life to this process, and he's transformed my life and many of my friends' lives, and he could transform yours. I highly recommend and suggest that you come see what he has to offer here. It is truly remarkable. It's amazing to see one's own potential unfold like the flowers that you witness every single week. And just what a delight to be here. I hope we get to do some more interviews in the future. Thank you so much. I really
Wonderful
appreciate
to
your
be
time.
with you.
Yeah, really,
Yes,
really
yes,
great. I
thank you
really
kindly.
appreciate you. Thank you.
Your dear friend.
Thank you so much. All right, so for you out there, check the show notes. We'll have all the links and so that you can get access to it, and look forward to seeing you expand your mind.
At Bioptimizers, our mission is to fix digestion. And a cornerstone of digestion is gut flora. P3OM is our patented probiotic formula. In fact, we call it the Navy SEALs of probiotics. You see, strong proteolytic or protein digesting activity is paramount to having a healthy gut flora. And of course, P3OM provides that. The good news is, unlike weaker probiotics, P3OM survives the digestion process. What it does is it basically multiplies the good guys while protecting you against pathogens, or what some people call the bad guys. P3OM really helps to rebuild your digestion. And what that allows you to do is to maximize nutrient uptake, energy, and metabolism. To find out more of how P3OM can help you, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.